Hi, this is Dina for Splitcoaststampers. In this tutorial, I'll show you an artist's technique called Pointillism that you can use for coloring images with markers. I'm using alcohol markers for this tutorial, but you can use water-based markers as well. The basic technique of Pointillism is just using tiny dots instead of strokes for coloring. You can add shading by layering different colored dots and by changing the spacing of your dots. Here I'm starting with my lightest color, and I'm spacing the dots out from each other at first. I can always go back and add more dots later, but I sure can't take them away. So I want to just add an even layer of color to start. On this first card, I'm using a fine tip marker and very small dots to create the pointillism effect. On my second sample, I'm going to use brush markers, and I'll show you some time-saving tips for larger areas and images. That first layer of dots will remain as my highlight layer, and I'll begin adding a second layer of dots with a slightly darker color, and I'll add those dots to areas that would be shaded. I add shading to areas that are hidden behind something, areas that are lower on the image, and areas that are farther away or curving away. If you need some help with shading your images, we have a tutorial on Splitcoast called Shading with Pencils that has lots of tips and tricks. Even though it's a pencil tutorial, the theory of shading and the different techniques can be applied to any medium. Another way you can add more dimension to your colored piece when you're using pointillism is the spacing between your dots. On the piece that I'm coloring now, where the dots are closer together, the color appears darker than where the dots are spaced out a little bit more. So that's another way that you can add detail and dimension to your piece as you color. I'm using a third and darker color now to just deepen the shadows where I've already started coloring them in and add more dimension to the flower using the same techniques that I've used already in this video. Notice again that where the dots are more concentrated, that color looks darker. And where I just want a tiny bit of shadow, I can just place one or two dots, and that does still have an effect. I'm going back with my second color and adding some more dots to kind of blend the lines between those colors together. Not the lines, but the borders between the sections of dots. You can always go back and add more dots to increase the concentration of your coloring and also to deepen shadows. Here I'm going back in with my first color to add a few more dots to make the dots appear closer together and blend the borders between the colors just a little bit more. And finally I'll use a blue-gray to add a few dots just to deepen shadows and add a little more detail and dimension. Here's the image completely colored in, and how I used it on a completed card. For a different look in pointillism, you can use the tip of a brush marker to make varying sizes of dots. And this is a great way for filling in larger areas or larger images. Another time-saving tip that I use is to completely color in the first layer of color. And for me, that's usually my lightest color. And that gives me an even base of color that I can add shading to with dots of varying sizes. To that base of color, I just continue adding dots with the pointillism technique as I did before. But in those lower areas of the shadows, I don't mind adding some brush strokes to fill an area in completely. I also use larger dots toward the bottom of the shaded area or the base of the shaded area. I'll use smaller dots toward the lighter areas of the card and where I know two colors are going to be joining together. The same theories of shading and color are used in this method as well. It's just a different way to combine strokes and techniques to save some time and give a little bit of a different look. Feel free to play around with this and find what works for you. Also remember that you can go back in with lighter colors to blend the borders between your colors better and to add more dimension to your image. If you're using a much darker color for your deepest shadows, remember that a very tiny bit of color will go a long way with this technique. Make those darkest dots as tiny as possible. Here's a closer look at that completely colored image and how I turned it into a card. I hope you'll try this technique out. Thank you so much for watching.